Now time to bring you a feature on the show today. Now we're looking at unemployment in the country. An analysis of post-COVID-19 employment prospect projects, global unemployment will reach 205 million in 2022, greatly surpassing the pre-crisis level of 187 million in the year 2019. Well, this is according to the International Labour Organization in its new edition of the World Employment and Social Outlook Trends 2021. Authors of the report say that COVID-19 pandemic is not just a health crisis, it's also an employment and human crisis that would have long-lasting ramifications for economies around the world. They say the social and economic impact of the pandemic is far from over and will continue to be felt until at least 2023. ILO Director-General Guy Ryder says the employment situation in low-income countries such as Nigeria is expected to be worse than in high-income countries. He also says the wealthier nations that have better access to vaccines and strong fiscal support are likely expected to recover faster from the crisis. Now, for many millions of people, the working hour losses combined with a lack of absence of social protection have simply meant an increase in poverty. Now, an estimated 31 million working people are now classified as extremely poor, living on less than the international poverty line of $1.90 per day. Now, we're looking at 5 years of progress also reduced due to poverty and also being wiped out by the coronavirus pandemic. Furthermore, the report finds out that the worst affected regions in the first half of this year have been Latin America, the Caribbean and Europe, Central Asia as well as Africa, and global employment is expected to later get better as we wrap up the year 2021, provided the pandemic does not throw any new curve. Nigeria's unemployment rate so far as at the end of the year 2020 was pegged at 33.3% from the 27.1% recorded in the first half of last year. Well, joining me now to discuss this and much more, I have Ayodele Adio, the managing editor of Daily Avalon. Good to have you on the breakfast show this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Now, discussing the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic we've had, this is a human crisis. It's beyond just health. Now, looking at the fact that there's a resounding call for government to feel the pulse of the nation, understand the times, and a whole lot more, we have two approaches now. The first is that government is doing its bit. We have the promise from the government stating that we'll have millions of jobs created. We are looking at documents like the poverty reduction and growth strategy paper. But for the man on the street, all of these does not make sense, really, because we don't have MSMEs as much as possible having all of the incentives. These are the engine of growth, the biggest employers of labor. So we're just at the same old status quo. So many people get sacked, others are falling bankrupt, and it's just a case of no light at the end of the tunnel for so many. Since last year, haven't gotten any job.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sad situation. About 20% of people lost their jobs due to the pandemic last year. People predominantly in the tourism sector, hospitality businesses, aviation lost a lot of jobs. So many small businesses went under the carpet because consumer demand shrunk over that period, and it's been difficult for them to recover. Now, you know, what you would have expected to see is some sort of a bold plan that stimulates the economy in a very large scale, that gives incentives to small and medium businesses to continue to stay afloat, and of course to stimulate the larger economy for it to continue to create more jobs, and of course to continue to drive consumption. To that extent, of course, the government has done its, has done quite fairly in terms of releasing. I think last year was about if I remember correctly, about 200 billion to small, medium businesses at very low interest rates. They have also had some sort of social welfare scheme where they distributed, I think, about 10,000 nairas to small, to petty traders, and to households that have very low income. But unfortunately, the problem has been the scale of this program, the reach of this program, and how coordinated the implementation of these programs has been. It's been quite disjointed between the federal and state governments. There has been a lack of cohesion, and that has made the impact of these projects at best minimal. You want to see better coordination of those programs, and those programs to target SMEs and to target people that need many of these interventions. But predominantly, outside the social welfare scheme that has been driven by the social investment program of the federal government, there's been little to target the larger economy, which is where the rubber really meets the road, because if the larger economy doesn't grow, if there is no real rebound, it makes it much more difficult to create jobs. And that's why you see that our unemployment and poverty numbers are on the rise. And until we fix the larger problem of the economy and make it able to create meaningful jobs, and it's able to increase the average wages of the average Nigerian, we'll just be blinking in the dark.
I like the fact that you make mention of increasing the average wages of Nigerians. Now, looking at the international poverty line, a whole lot of thousands, millions have dropped into this category of extremely poor individuals. The cost of living is rising higher and higher. Despite the inflation figures we have as it now, Nigerians are paying much more for everything, simply from energy to food and a whole lot more. Now, if we are talking about living wages, we had the challenge of underemployed before we now look at unemployment, and all of these categories are now being heavily affected by all of this cost implications. How then do we develop models that work, not necessarily just throwing money? That's the sentiment there. Not throwing money to the problem, but having chains or value chains of operations or links that would generate jobs, sustain their revenue generation capacity, and keep people occupied.
I mean, a lot of things would need to be done. There's no...
I'd like you to use your paper we know you're working on as a case study, for example, highlighting some of the strategies we can adopt.
Yeah, like there's no magic bullet to it. And you talked about the paper. There's an interesting policy document. I think it was presented 2 days ago by the Youth Party, and it talks about 5 pillars of driving an economic renaissance. And 5 of those pillars majorly is 1, deregulation. Of course, the ability to deregulate many of these red tapes that you find, and that makes it difficult for businesses to thrive in our country. Now, whether it's policy inconsistency, whether it's too much bureaucracy that makes it difficult, and the lack of predictability in the business environment. So that seeks to take care of that fundamentally. Of course, the second is the skill and infrastructural gap. Now, every major economy that has moved from a poor nation to a middle-income country or a rich country in the last 40 years have done that by investing critically in education and in infrastructural development. It's impossible to achieve that without those 2 critical things, whether it was Vietnam after the 1975 war, whether it was Brazil, or whether it was Ireland, whether it was Singapore, whether it was South Korea. They invested critically in education and infrastructural development, and would like to see that happen in our country. We cannot talk about trying to create meaningful jobs and to boost trade and exports in our country if our papa remains what it is today, if most of the connectivities across our country in terms of road and rail infrastructure are nowhere where it's supposed to be, and of course if we don't have the kind of skills required to compete in the 21st century. So that is very critical for us to do. The third, of course, are sector-specific incentives targeted at driving manufacturing and processing. And these are sectors that create jobs in its tens and hundreds of thousands. Now, what this country needs to do is to find the right kinds of incentives. For instance, Ireland did it by dropping corporate rates to about 12.5%, and global manufacturing giants and IT companies relocated headquarters to Ireland. We will need to find a sustainable incentives, whether it's tax breaks, whether it's credit guarantees to these big manufacturing companies who have the capacity to create meaningful jobs, to be able to stay afloat over a long period of time. So these are the things that we really need to do to be able to target jobs. And the plan clearly states that if we do these 5 things, in the next 4 years, we'll be able to create at least 5 million jobs.
Ayodele, now wrapping up our conversation, in the case we are throwing another curveball, we are dealing with the COVID-19 here, and there can be surprises now. We're looking at improved vaccination and a whole lot more. But what do you think would be our biggest mistake if we don't take action now, if we have another curveball, say 2022, the first quarter?
Well, you even have a bigger problem than COVID-19 because first of all, as we speak, GDP per capita is about just a little above $2,000, which means you're even doing badly than Ghana, who is our neighbors. They have a better GDP per capita income. It's even worse because our GDP per capita has dropped.
Wrapping up our thoughts there, looking at world employment and social outlook, the call for cushions and then strategic interventions to ensure that we have a larger reach of the populace. Now, looking at the biggest mistake we can make in case another curveball is thrown at us. You made mention of per capita GDP rate. We are also looking at insecurity, which is largely threatening the business climate. So there's just a lull across every single border or edge we're looking at this point in time, and it's very difficult for the average Nigerian to see any light at the end of the tunnel. What would be our biggest mistake with another curveball?
Well, our biggest mistake is that we're not even recognizing the mistake that we're currently, or the trap that we're currently falling into, because by the end of 2023, what it would have meant is that we would have lost an entire decade. Interest rates are high, unemployment is high, poverty is high, per capita income is dwindling, wages are stagnating, purchasing power eroding. That means essentially you would have lost an entire decade by 2023, which means a young man that started his life at the age of 22 would eventually come out at 32 being poorer than he went into his early 20s, which is a very dangerous turn. And most of the crises that we face today, the socioeconomic crisis that we face today, are largely underpinned by unemployment and poverty. Now, the terrible part is that once you fail to tackle the ability to create jobs, to grow the economy, and to boost employment, insecurity will continue to rise. And the more insecurity continues to rise, the more investors will vote with their monies outside the country. And that continues a vicious cycle of poverty and unemployment. And to break that jinx, we need a political will to implement plans that work, to have the courage to push through reforms that will create wealth for our citizens and to distribute that wealth accordingly across the country.
We definitely need a stronger will to push through reforms that would have more impact and change. Thank you very much for your time on the Breakfast Show this morning.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you.